What shows up every time we show up? That's what we're going to talk about today from 1 Peter in our series, Just Visiting. We've covered the big four, who we are, the hope that we have, pursuing holiness and staying together. But what is all of it for? That's what we're going to look at in 1 Peter chapter 2. So I want to encourage you to download the teaching notes, grab somebody to watch along with, because here we go. If you are jumping in today, I want to encourage you, find your way to 1 Peter chapter 2. We want to listen to God. We want to do things His way. We want to become more and more like Him. We just believe more and more that He just knows. And if we just do things the way He's invited us to, yeah, sometimes things are a little more challenging, but they are always better. In fact, what makes any of us who have found our way toward Jesus, followers of Jesus, is we kind of ran the course of doing things our own, and it did not go well. Can I get an from anyone who did it on their own for a while? And then we encountered Jesus and found out that He did not have judgment, criticism, or condemnation in mind. He wanted to call us to life in all the best ways. Does He correct us sometimes? Absolutely, because kind of honestly, let's just be honest, head nod everybody, we need a little correction sometimes. Our best ideas aren't always actually the best, and He always leads us to better. He has good in mind for us. So we're exploring that in this series called Just Visiting. I don't know what kind of world you live in, but the world I live in, I just have this sense that things could be better. Does that seem right? And maybe they should be better. The idea is that this place as it is, there's a reason we don't have a lot of contentment in it. The story of the Bible is that at one point everything was right, and in the end God will make everything right. But in between, people have gone looking for good without God. And anytime you go looking for good without God, stuff gets messed up. And so we live in a messed up world. Can I get a yep? And so the question is, how do we live in Jesus' direction? How do we let Him turn our lives right side up in a world that just seldom cooperates? Not because they're necessarily against it, it's just a different set of values, a different current, a different roll downhill in people's lives. But we're like, no, we want to live in Jesus' direction. And oftentimes we run into opposition at times. It can just be challenging. Not even just opposition around us, sometimes opposition within us, if we're being honest. Like we just have these tendencies that pull us in a different direction, but we want to hold on to God and head His direction. And so we've been giving everybody the big four, as you're finding your way to 1 Peter, there's these big four things that we've been holding on to. I just want to remind us really quickly. Number one, we are holding on in a world that doesn't always cooperate us. We are holding on to our identity. Tell somebody, remember who you are. Now, listen, you can look lots of places in the world from who you are, and the world will tell you you just need to look within for who you are. And while that may be partially right, who we are looking to is Jesus. Jesus gets to tell us who we are. He says we are known, we are chosen, we are holy, we have purpose. He says so much about who we are. And so when we say, remember who you are, we want to remember who Jesus says we are. People's faces when we walk into a place, the things that we wear or drive or the things that we live in do not dictate who we are. Our net worth does not dictate who we are. Our preferences or desires do not dictate who we are. We are allowing Jesus to direct and remind us who we are. So tell somebody around you, remember who you are. If you're trying to find your way in the direction of Jesus, this is thing number one. Who does Jesus say you are? Who is He and who does He say you are? So if you're finding your way, this is step one. We also hold on to hope. In a world where it feels like, hey, you better enjoy it while it lasts because it's not going to last. And where it seems like things like the bad will never end, things just keep coming off the rails, Jesus has a different word. He says, no, let's just get the story straight. In Jesus, the bad won't last and the good will never end. This is the hope that we have in Jesus. And so we hold on to who we are and we hold on to hope. We also pursue holiness. Tell somebody, get after it. Like we are going after holiness. Downhill is not in the direction of what is best for us. Yes, it takes some effort. Yes, we need to listen and pay attention to God, but He gets to say how we live. Holiness is not just some churchy way of life. Holiness is like pursuing God's character and becoming like His Son, Jesus. This is who we are. And finally, we do this together. Tell somebody, stay together. Stay together. We need one another to do this because it's challenging. Can I get a yep? And sometimes we trip and fall down and we need somebody to pick us up. And sometimes we get it right and we need somebody to celebrate with. We need people. These are the big four. It reminds me of my growing up years. My dad was a teacher, in my memory of life, but prior to that, he had been a union carpenter because his dad was a construction supervisor. So he had all the skill set and all the tools that he needed. And so in the summers, he would supplement his teaching income by building a house from the ground up. We lived in a small town, so we would just find a family that needed or wanted a new home, and he would become the GC, the general contractor, and we would only subcontract a few things. And so as a young kid, I would get dragged onto the job site to be the gopher. You know what a gopher is? Go for this, go for that, right? That's what you have to do. You just run errands for the people who are doing the work. And then I picked up the mess. Eventually, he gave me a hammer and some nails when we were putting shingles on a roof with a little nail apron, and I thought I was big stuff. And then one day, finally, he takes me to the hardware store and buys me a leather tool belt. And I'm just like, listen, I did not think you'd be that excited about you. Ooh. It was a pretty cool trip with my dad, though. Like, I had graduated. I was like one of the guys. And so I just had to pay attention and learn. And here's how every day started. We'd walk to the back of our bright red 1979 Dodge Ram pickup, pull the 4 or 5 toolboxes to the edge of the tailgate, and everybody would grab 4 or 5 things. At least we would grab a hammer, a tape measure, a pencil, a utility knife, and a combo square every single time. Didn't matter what we were doing that day, all those things. Now, we may need other stuff depending on where we were at in the job, but at least those things would come around. And actually, I always used to put my hammer on the left side, even though I'm right-handed, just because that's the way my dad did it. I was like 18 years old before he finally said, "Why do you do that?" Because I always had to reach across my body, but I'm like, "I just watched you, Dad. This is your fault." And I still to this day. Listen, no good work was going to get done unless we had those tools. So listen, 8 a.m. sharp, we would start the workday, and everybody loaded up with tools, and we were off to the job site. Everybody's assigned different things. But here's the thing. Day didn't stop when we put all the tools in the tool belt. That was where the day started. The point was not having the right tools. The point was what happened next. What are you going to do with the tools that you have? So while we have talked about the big 4, we need to talk about, but what are we doing with all of this? I'm afraid that if we just stop where we've come so far, we might say, oh, how do we survive and just hold on in a world that doesn't cooperate? No, are you kidding me? Our calling is so much higher than that. It's not about collecting tools in a new tool belt. It's about what we're going to do next, how we're going to build some things. And so if last week was about staying together, this week is all about going together. Tell somebody, let's go. Let's go. This is what. Now listen, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I just want you to know, like, we are, all of us who are followers of Jesus, and this is what you are invited to with nothing standing in your way other than your desire, is you got not only get to remember because of who Jesus says who you are and have the hope, a confident expectation of good, a better model for a way of life in Jesus and people to support you along the way. You are also invited to turn the world right side up in Jesus' name. And so when we say, let's go, that's what we're about. Not running around correcting everybody as the truth police, but calling people alive the way Jesus has called us alive by the way that we live. That's what we're getting after together. If last week was staying together, this week is as we go together. Tell somebody, let's go. All right, so listen, here's what we're going to do. We got 3 images right out of 1 Peter today. We're going to start in verse 4 here in a second. All right, so in verse 4 it says this. Don't forget who you are. Remember, it says, you are coming to Christ. You are the ones who are pointing your life toward Jesus. Peter's reminding these people in a tough time, in a tough place, don't forget who you are. You're coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. Now remember, Peter was talking to people who had been rejected by culture to a certain degree, so he's like, listen, you follow a leader who was rejected. Don't be surprised you were rejected. But God chose him for great honor. His implication is the same is true for us. And so if Jesus is the living cornerstone, he says, you all are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. All right, now listen, you got to buckle up. Everybody sit up straight for just a minute and turn your curiosity dial all the way up for a minute. I'm going to go full documentary on you here for just a second, okay? I'm going to reach deep into history, but the landing point is so important you can't miss it. Peter had grown up in a Jewish home, and he knew the long history of God's people. And the passage we're looking at this week in particular is full of callbacks to the long history of God's people that were full of meaning for the people that he was writing to. And for us, we need just a little bit of help to catch the meaning, all right? So let me go all the way back. God speaks the world into existence and everything is good. People were with God. God was with people. Nothing was broken. No one was separate. No sickness, no death, no harm, no lack, no sadness, no nothing. And then people went looking for good without God and wrecked it. And ever since, God has been orchestrating a way for all of people to come back to him and experience all the good he had in mind from before. This is what the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, are all about. The story of God orchestrating a journey in a direction that would point to Jesus. But there are so many important steps along the way. I'm going to skip several and go right to this guy named Abraham. Abraham was a guy that God said, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to grow your family so large it's going to turn into a nation. And I'm going to bless that nation so much that when the whole world looks at that nation, they will see how amazing I am. He makes that promise, and over the course of the next several hundred years, his family grows to a group of about 2 million people. But by the book of Exodus, these people are actually in slavery in Egypt. You may have heard of a guy named Moses. A guy named Moses, God goes to him and said, you're going to rescue my people out of slavery. They've grown to this large nation, and it's time for me to carry them into a land that will be their own. And so Moses goes and in a miraculous story rescues all of them out. But here's what I don't want you to miss, is that for generations, people didn't know what it was to walk with God. They caught a sense of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some of those patriarchs of this family had encounters with God, but the average person didn't know exactly what that was looking like. They were just following the family in which they had been placed. But now there's this nation of people being carried out of slavery, and God says, I want you to be unmistakably clear that I want you to be with me and me to be with you. That starts with Moses. Moses trying to lead these 2 million people through the desert out of slavery. They've never known anything other than being told what to do 7 days a week, slaving away at labor in Egypt. They're carried into the wilderness, and Moses is like, I don't know how to lead these people. So God says, I'll meet with you. He sets up a tent of meeting just outside the camp, and Moses would go, and God would help him know how to lead people. But God wasn't just going to stay with one person. He also wanted all of his people to know he'd be with them. So maybe you've heard of the 10 Commandments, along with that, he gives instructions for a larger tent called the tabernacle that would be set up everywhere this nation of Israel would camp. The Hebrew nation would camp, and they would set up this tent. And in this tent, there were like separate rooms that would be like an approach to God. Like, God can't be contained in any place in his creation. Creator doesn't fit inside creation. But he wanted them to know, I have a place among you. So they would set this tent up. Beautiful construction. You should read Numbers and Leviticus next time you are like ready to like grind through something. It's a tough read. But so specific, so holy a place that God said, this will serve as like a footstool for me, just so you know I'm among you. Like, just let that land for a minute. The Creator enters creation in a way that the creation can experience him, even though all they had ever really done was turn their backs on him. Well, eventually he does carry them into a land, and they set up a permanent one of these. It's called the temple. It was placed on what would be known as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem today. And so the first permanent temple, a beautiful, epic structure, wonder of the world at the time, became this place of approach, and it became this symbol of God's presence among his people. But this temple, here's what you need to know. All across these hundreds of years of history we've recited so far, this is what you need to know what the temple stood for. The temple is where God met with people and people met with God. I told you I'm going full documentary. You got to stay with me. We're really only up to about 957 BCE at this point. Epic temple became the meeting place. And it became a symbol for whether God's presence was among them or not, who had control of the temple. And back and forth across the history of God's people, it was pretty wishy-washy. In fact, it was destroyed in 586 when all of Israel was carried out of that land. It was rebuilt in 536 after they came back from exile, but by 70 AD, 70 years after the birth of Jesus, it's destroyed again. It became this symbol. Is God among us? Is he not? Is God for us? Is he not? Is God present? Is he not? How are we doing in our relationship with God? By the time of Jesus, the temple was like very iffy because they were occupied by other people. Like I said, by 70 AD, it would be destroyed again. And so everybody had this question, is God with us or is he not? Enter Jesus, who we know from this point in history looking back was God entering creation, fully God and fully man. But people didn't get it. They were still waiting for the temple. They wanted the temple to be rebuilt and reestablished so they would know God was among them. And Jesus is like, I'm right here. In fact, he goes into the temple one day, which had turned into this kind of business operation. He takes a whip and flips some tables and runs off all the money changers who were taking advantage of people. He said, this is where people come to meet with God. This is a place of prayer. You cannot take advantage of people or marginalize people in this place, and he runs them off. The religious leaders of the time say, what gives you the right to do this? And this is what Jesus said. They said, give us a sign that you have the kind of authority to do something like that. And this is what Jesus says. Destroy this what? And in 3 days, I will raise it up. They didn't get it. They were imagining the temple that was within view. They were imagining the temple they had always known. In fact, there was a larger second temple built many years before, and they're like, well, when is this going to get rebuilt? When is this going to happen? When is it going to be reestablished? And Jesus is like, I'll give you a sign. Destroy this temple. And they're thinking bricks and mortar. It's not what Jesus was thinking. But here's what they say in verse 20. What? They exclaimed. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days? As usual, they just didn't get it. John, in John chapter 2, where this is located, he says, but when Jesus said this temple, he meant his what? His own body. Here's what I don't want you to miss. His followers would understand this after Jesus resurrected, because how many days was Jesus in the grave? Yeah, they counted days different than us. But yes, 3 days. And so he does rebuild the temple he was speaking of in 3 days. This is what Jesus was saying. He was saying, it's no longer a building where you meet with people. Now I am where God meets with people and people with God. This is what Jesus is saying. After all of that long history, God was saying, I will be among you. I'll be among you. Jesus is saying, no. Now I am among you. I am where God meets with people and people meet with God. Jesus did raise on the third day, and because he did, we believe everything he said. And one of the things he said is that we now become the place where God's Spirit dwells. You need all the 1,000 years of history to be mind-boggled that God would show up among his people in a holy place in which that happens so that people could start to understand that God coming in among them. But when Jesus says, I am here, I am God among you, and then he says, I will not just be among you, I will be in you, then Peter can say something crazy like, you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. I told you the documentary had a point. Are you catching it? Mind-boggling that God would show up with his people. First in a tent with a man, then a tent with a people, then a permanent temple among his people, then God himself showing up in creation. But how does God show up to people now? In case I'm not being clear, God's people are now where God meets with people and people meet with God. As important as the temple was for all of Old Testament history, you, as a follower of Jesus, are now where God meets with people and people meet with God. I don't want you to miss it. The temple of God walks in everywhere a Christian walks in. The meeting place with God shows up everywhere we show up. Are y'all catching it? Start doing the math. Maybe start reflecting for a moment about the way we showed up in the places we showed up this past week. That's a temple image. Let me give you a second one so we don't miss it. He goes on, and Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, if you have your Bibles, you should underline this. What's more, you are his holy priest. Tell somebody you're a priest. People come up to me all the time, and they're like, hey, Pastor Drew, Pastor Drew, Pastor Drew, Pastor Drew, Pastor Drew. I'm like, hey, it's just Drew, right? I appreciate the honor, appreciate the respect, especially for my Air Force community. You guys are so honoring in the way that you title and do different things. But and while maybe I have some different education than some people do, I just want you to say, I want all of us to acknowledge all of us are priests. In fact, somebody keeps calling me Pastor Drew and refuses to stop. I just threaten them to return the favor. I just start calling them Pastor whatever. Because this is what Peter is saying. You, followers of Jesus, the moment you point your life toward Jesus, you not only become the temple, the meeting place with God, you become the facilitator of that meeting. You become the one who arranges for that. A priest in the Old Testament was all about interceding, protecting, teaching, pointing people toward God and the things of God. This is who we are. This is not just what we do, it's who we are. So it colors everything that we do. When you walk into a place, Christian, when you walk into a place, follower of Jesus, a priest walks into that place as a representative of God's presence, inviting people toward God and bringing God toward people. The way we treat them brings God to them, and the way we invite them in his direction brings them to him. Across the long history I've recited, I'll go much quicker this time. The priestly order would be this particular group of people in that particular place who would do particular things to help people toward God. They would offer gratitude offerings, like the first part of any harvest or a wine that had been produced, that would be offered to God to say, God, we only have this because of you. When people failed or messed up, they would go to the temple and priests would offer sacrifices to remind them that sin kills stuff. It wrecks stuff. It's costly, and it's not just costly for you, it's costly for your family. They would do all kinds of things. You have to read it through the course of the Old Testament. And then among the priestly order, there was this one priest called the high priest. In fact, he was the only one who got to go into God's presence. While God was among his people, only one person got to go into God's presence. In the tabernacle and in the temple, there was this special place called the Holy of Holies. And inside there was what's known as the Ark of the Covenant. A little bit like Indiana Jones, not terribly informative. Anyway, it was not like housing God. It was a representative of his footstool. No place on earth could contain God. In fact, that was the difference between the temple of God and the temple of all the other gods of the time, is there was no idol in God's temple because God cannot be contained. Nothing can represent or contain who he is. But this high priest, only one person in one place, one time a year got to enter God's presence to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the whole group of people. And my favorite thing about it was they put bells on his robe and tied a rope around his ankle. Do you know why? Because God's presence is not a place to be flippant. God is not to be taken lightly. God is not our big buddy in the sky. He's not just a little bit better than the best person you've ever met. He is wholly other. No beginning, no end, unlike any other. And so when we enter his presence, if we're even half honest about who we are, we have no place in the presence of someone like that. And yet, in the Old Testament, all kinds of preparations would be made, and those bells would be on his robe and the rope around his ankle. So, if he had failed to prepare adequately, or if he offended God and lost his life, they could drag him out. That's how serious God's presence was. Do you know where I'm going with this yet? Jesus would become the high priest we always needed. If you read across the Old Testament, each priestly order, they were humans like us, and they botched it and botched it and botched it. The whole story creates this angst in us of, we need a better high priest. And Jesus was it. If you've ever read the New Testament book of Hebrews, that's the story of Hebrews. He's the high priest we've always needed. But then Jesus does this thing where he says, because of what I've done for you, Jesus was not just God represented among creation. Jesus was, by his Spirit, going to indwell or live in and among all of God's people. Are you doing the math yet? This holiest of holy places in a temple, where does it live now? In everyone who trusts Jesus. Because of what Jesus did for us. Back then, a priest would offer one sacrifice one time a year to cover for 1 year, but Jesus offered a sacrifice for all time, for all people, so that, like the book of Hebrews says, we can boldly enter God's presence, not because of anything we have ever done, but because of what Jesus did for us. And so now we can not only enter God's presence, we can count on God's presence. And everywhere we go, God's presence shows up, which is why we are the temple, which is why we are a royal priesthood. Every single one of us who follows Jesus, you're a priest. Tell somebody, you're a priest. If you haven't pointed your life toward Jesus, you are invited to be a priest. You are invited to be the place God sets up camp, dwells, turns your life right side up, but carrying him everywhere you go to help others do the same. Your calling could not be higher. The meaning for your life could not be more important. So I just don't want to miss this. We are not in the temple where a bunch of people have come to hear from a priest. Are you doing the math on what's happening? That's not what this is. The temple is no longer a place. The temple is a people. And there is no longer a separate order of priests that have a different role than all of. In fact, from the very beginning in Exodus 19, it was always God's intention that all of his people would be priests. And now, because of what Jesus has done for all of us are priests. And so this is not the temple where a bunch of people come to hear from a priest. This is a gathering of priests listening to God together so that we remember who we are, so that we hold on to hope, so that we grow in holiness and we stand together as we go into a world that needs a better identity, a better kind of hope, a different direction of life, and a whole different character of community. This is the calling on your life. Are you feeling the weight of it yet? Let's go, she says. Tell somebody, let's go. Let me be hyper clear because I love football season. In your faith, this is not game time. This is halftime. The game is everywhere else. This is where the team, whether we got beat up this week, whether we're falling behind, whether we had the greatest high or the lowest low, we come together back in the locker room to remember what it is that we're called to do, to reestablish our marching orders, to remember we are surrounded by other people with the same values, going the same direction, with the same God, the same Spirit in us, to be encouraged, to be awakened, to be reminded, to be healed up, to be surrounded, to be hugged, to be smiled at, and all the different things that fill us up to go back into a world that seldom cooperates and live in a different way. This is halftime. Tell somebody, let's go. And so listen, we are the people, royal priests. We are the people. In the Old Testament, some like one offering in different ways at a specific time, but Jesus, one sacrifice for all time so that all of us could become living sacrifices, Romans 12 says. That everywhere we go, we offer sacrifices that please God. We give ourselves away. We give our time away. We give our money in directions that help people come alive in Him. We give our words away. We show up with a certain kind of presence that when people encounter us, they encounter something different. That they say, whoa, what is it to step into this person's presence? No one sauntered into the temple in the Old Testament, and no one should show up in our presence without a marked expectation of different than they encounter anywhere else. When we walk into their coffee shop, that place should come alive with a different kind of spirit and a different kind of energy. When we walk into work, we don't walk in like everybody else walks in because we are a living temple. We are living stones being arranged into God's temple where God dwells. We are royal priests, the place where people meet with God and God meets with people. Being priests is not something that we do sometimes in some places. It is who we are. And because it is, it colors everything we do. Everything we do. Everywhere we go. Every time we post. Every word we say. Not because we're perfect or we'll ever get it right, but we know we're forgiven, so we have no problem owning the times we don't show up well. Apologizing and saying, that's not who I want to be. I want to show up better. Please forgive me. All of those become opportunities. Peter says, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And as a result, you can show others the goodness. Tell somebody, show me the goodness. If you don't know what movie that's from, ask somebody over 35, okay? Show me the goodness. This is what we are called to everywhere we go. The people, when they encountered God's tabernacle, God's temple, when they encountered Jesus, they encountered good and they encountered God's presence, and the same should be true for us. This is why we've been called this. This is the purpose. When we load up the tool belt, this is the work we go to do, to show others the goodness of God. We take God to people. In Royal Priests, we bring people to God. He says, for you were called out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you had no identity as a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received God's mercy, and that should change everything. When we have received God's mercy, when we've embraced the identity that he has given us, it changes everything about where we show up, and suddenly dark places become light. We have a simple picture for the way we tell these stories. Here's Peter giving us his 15-second transformation story. There was a time in my life I lived in darkness, and Jesus showed up and pointed me toward the light. Do you have a story like that? There was a time when we were distant, separate, all kinds of divided groups of people, but Jesus brought us together under someone and something that matters so much more, and now we are the people of God. Do you have a story like that? He says, once we were a people who had not received mercy. We were just trying to overcome the bad we had done with the good we could do, and we were exhausted and wiped out. But now, because of Jesus, he took all of that on himself, and now we have received mercy. We are a people marked by mercy. We are a people who offer mercy. Do you have a story like that? This is who we are, such a high calling. Are you feeling it? Are you feeling it? But would you just look around the room for a minute? Look around. Risk the awkward eye contact. If you make it awkward on purpose, it's less awkward and a little more funny. I just want to remind you, we are not priests alone. We're not a holy nation alone. We need to stay together. Stand with one another. Pick one another up. Carry one another forward. And when we can't physically go with someone, we go in their text stream praying for them. We ask the people around us to go with us because we want to show up the places that we show up well. And can I get an that some places it's hard to show up well? Sometimes at home, it's hard to show up well. Sometimes at work, it's hard to show up well. Sometimes on the 95, most of the time, it's hard to show up well. Listen, but our calling demands it. And not only do we have the support of one another, we have the support of God's Spirit alive in us. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, if he can do that, he can carry you into work to bear God's presence. If he can do that, he can carry you through the tough family situation that you are in. If he can do that, he can carry you with all of your anxiety and worry about the diagnosis you're about to get into the doctor's office when you talk to the nursing staff, when the doctor comes in and she tells you what's going on. All of these kind of spaces, he can carry you in to be a living temple, to be royal priests. This is why Peter says our third image and final. Dear friends, I warn you, this is in chapter 2. Dear friends, I warn you, as temporary residents and foreigners, we're just visiting, to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. There's all kinds of things that we get distracted and forget who we are, and we lose the script. We think a place is there to serve us. We think it's okay to complain like everybody else. We think they earned this kind of verbal attack. And none of those things are true in the economy of God. They just aren't. I love the way the Message says it. It says, friends, this world is not your home. So don't get cozy in it. It says, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they'll see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. This is how we show up, carefully to live honoring God above everything else. And when people see our honorable behavior, it won't always make sense. They won't always agree. They won't always even necessarily appreciate it. But there will come a day they will give honor. In fact, the next slide will tell you this is what happens when we do that. They will see and they will give honor. They will see and they will give honor. Who in your life is seeing who God is and giving honor to God because of the way we, holy nation, royal priest, living stones, are showing up? Let me land it really quickly. I'm about to get personal. You ready? Where are you going this week? You know what? Let's go backwards first. Where did you go this last week? Royal priests, where did you go this last week? Think through it, call it to mind, work through your week in your mind. Just rehearse the path you've been on the last few days. We don't control outcomes, but we do control effort. Did we walk into those places remembering that we are royal priests, living stones, the place where people meet with God and God meets with people. Without any condemnation or judgment, we should be able to look back with real transparency and ask ourselves, is this a week I forgot who I was? If it is, this is the beautiful part about Jesus. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We have nothing to hide and nothing to fear, so we can just agree with God when he says, hey man, I don't know if you showed up real well at that place. Hey, I think you forgot who you were when you went here. Listen, we can just receive that, and he'll invite us forward like a loving father. It's totally fine. But now take your mind to where you're going next. Where are you going next? What does it look like for you to show up as a royal priest in the place that you will go when you leave this place? How would a royal priest bearing God's holy presence in your life and the high calling of bringing God to people and people to God, how would someone like that show up where you're about to show up? And then where will you go after that? How would a royal priest show up there? Tomorrow morning. Where are you going tomorrow morning? What does it mean to show up as a living stone, a royal priest, one who is not fit and belong in this place, who's just visiting, because this is not our home? How would we show up in a way that invites God's presence there? I just want to encourage you to keep allowing your mind to move forward. For any of you who are not yet followers of Jesus, you're like, I don't get it. I'm just going to tell you, when Jesus starts to turn your life right side up, we just can't imagine not being a part of what God's doing. It's our natural response. We're not trying to earn anything. He's already paid for everything, and we just get to be a part of what our Heavenly Father is doing. It is such a gift, all of us priests, to be joined in his family, to turn the world right side up like he turned our life right side up. And so if you've never pointed your life toward Jesus, I just want you to know it's not something that you earn. There's not payment to be made for everything in your past. That payment has already been made, just not by you. This is the message of Jesus, that he meets us right where we are, picks us up right where we are, starts to put us back together, and from day one makes us a priest. Not because we need to know everything to go, we just need to know what we know and go with that. I started with a nail apron and a janky hammer. You can start wherever you're at and start building with God the kind of things that he wants to put together in your life and other people. Whatever story God has written in your life, God put some great friends in my life that started to give me some hope that I never had before. That's a story you can share everywhere you go. All of us priests from day one who follow Jesus. So if you've never pointed your life toward Jesus, don't try to earn this by doing the right stuff. Acknowledge who he is, and he'll empower you to live in the right way. But for all of us who are followers of Jesus, we just cannot afford to forget who we are. Royal priests, a holy nation, and not by ourselves. So here's question 2. Who are you going with? Maybe physically, but maybe it's just in a text thread. We got these beautiful little things in our pockets called phones. We can show up lots of places. Only one place at a time, just so you know. But we can still show up and say, I'll go with you. I'm with you. I'm praying for you. I'll hold your arms up. I'll ask you how it went. We'll celebrate or cry together. Either way, I'm in. Because it's not just each of us, it's all of us. I want to invite you to stand, and here's what I want to invite you to do for the next few minutes. If you're not yet a follower of Jesus, I just encourage you. Maybe you ask the person that came along with you, what do I do next? How do I keep going? If you are a follower of Jesus, I encourage you to work through your week, maybe even talk to the person next to you about your week. Here's the places I'm showing up. Would you pray for me? Here's the place, man, I just botched this last week. I want to show up better. Would you pray for me? Hold those in your mind, and we're going to commit that because of the stable foundation God has arranged for us, we're going to launch from there and be the kind of people who go together. Tell somebody, let's go.
So where are you going? This week, next week, and the week after. Everywhere we show up, we get to show up in God's name. We get to be the place where people meet with God and God meets with people. And so I encourage you, think well, pray well, and show up together. If we can be a support to you in any way, we'd love to. Head over to canyonridge.org. You'll find everything you need to know, along with a way to get in touch with us. And if this was helpful to you, I encourage you to share it with a friend. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you soon.